Okay, I'm back for another session of our treatment of the New Testament and our confidence level with the New Testament as to its accuracy and what it has preserved over time. So, I wanted to finish on the nuts and bolts of New Testament text transmission. So every year, several New Testament manuscripts, handwritten in the original Greek format, are discovered. To my knowledge, the latest substantial find was in 2008, where 47 new manuscripts were discovered in Albania. These are probably a later date, I believe, but still they're very valuable. Those are always, every once in a while you'll hear of more being found. But when comparing one manuscript to another, you're going to always find disagreements, but I wouldn't call them disagreements. You're going to find variants, where mostly these are cases of again, innocent scribal errors. So because you have so many thousands of manuscripts, you have 300 to 400,000 variations. In each variation, if it occurs and it goes into the next line and the next of that manuscript tradition over time, it will be counted as another that same one scribal error will be counted again and again and again and again. So you may have 15 counts that goes into that 400,000 variations for one really true that's the actual variation, but in the copies it was preserved because these guys are stubborn, like I said before, and they're tenacious, and they're going to keep on writing that variant, even though we all know what it should be changed to make the spelling right or the grammar fixed or whatever. So more important estimates focus on comparing text within languages. So some of these are between different languages, and that increases the number of variants. But if you just stick with a text, when you got comparing a Latin version to a Greek, or Coptic to a Greek, you're gonna find maybe some variants that aren't really truly variants. They're just differences in how you would translate into that language. It makes it kind of muddy. So that 400,000 just includes it all. So that's probably a high number, a very high number. It's probably not really like that. That really didn't reflect the true nature of these variants and how many there really are. So more important estimates focus on comparing text within languages, and those variations are considerably fewer. So the vast majority are accidental errors made by scribes and are easily identified. You might have an omitted word, a duplicated line, a misspelling, a rearrangement of words, but you know obviously what happened. And you can tell what they did. Their eyes may have flitted over and seen the same Greek letter 2 lines down, and they left out a whole sentence and didn't see it. And the next guy that copied it left it out too, because that's what his copy had. And that just gets added up. Now, admittedly, some variations involved intentional changes, and that sometimes makes it more difficult to determine whether they were corrections from better exemplars. Maybe somebody suddenly in a lineage had a better exemplar and he corrected it, or maybe a guy was harmonizing between readings and was intentionally trying to make it look better, but that didn't happen as often as these other omissions of words and the like. And maybe in certain instances a variation was ideologically motivated. But these also can mostly be discovered over time, and you can tell where a guy did that. And the vast majority of the rest of them, and the earliest ones, etc., don't have that variant. You can still know with certainty that doesn't belong in the text as we reconstruct the original, trying to get back to the original way it was written. And that would be the autograph, trying to reconstruct the autograph of the original writer. So the science of textual criticism is the study of these manuscripts in order to reconstruct a probable original text. There's also a difficulty is in where the manuscripts are coming from. So we often get these from monasteries where they were saving them. So often a manuscript's cache is little more than a former manuscript recycling center where they had imperfect and incomplete copies of manuscripts stored. The most widely used one, why it may have been used up so much it was fell apart, or they may have had they didn't have paper in the same supplies we have now, so they may have had 4 or 5 copies of, let's say the book of Luke, and they didn't need that 5th copy, so they may have washed it off to write something else on top of it. But you can take these washed manuscripts and see the original hiding below it. You might have who knows what now on top of an old washed off manuscript, but you can see Luke, the Gospel of Luke, underneath it. And that's just because of their resources were different than ours today. And they didn't have as many pieces of paper, papyrus, like we have tons of paper now. They'd use their resources carefully and reuse what they had in different ways. So these are called palimpsests, I think is the way to say it. And the most famous is probably the Archimedes palimpsest, but there's a lot of those, and you have to use special equipment to see what's hidden underneath. But from those you can get, hey, that's an old copy of Luke, and it's valuable to know. But you can see a lot of our best copies and oldest copies are coming in ways that are kind of make it even more difficult, and may not even be the best copies we'd like. When washing was no longer an option, sometimes they would, if a manuscript was so beat up, they would burn it. They figured that burning was more reverent than simply throwing into a garbage pit. Though there's cases where you have, like in Oxyrhynchus, if that's the way to say it, you have papyri that come out of there that were from a garbage pit. But in many cases, they go ahead and burn them. Some of the best copies they burned. Not because they were trying to hide anything, but because it was so old and beat up, they didn't want to throw it in garbage, because it's the words of Christ. They'd go ahead and burn it instead to show it respect. And so, third option is just to leave it, some old manuscript, in what became known as a manuscript gravesite, or cache, which you have at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai, which is the source of the Codex Sinaiticus, or St. Savas' Monastery outside Bethlehem. It's not a library. It's just a place to put old texts. You don't know where else to put them. That's where they come from. That's where they found them. And maybe they have these old texts because and they stick them in a box. Nobody's reading them or using them because they do have variants. And that's why nobody's reading them or using them anymore, because they know there's some mistakes in them. But they don't want to toss them. They don't end up wanting to use it, so they happen to save them, and people forget about them, leave them in the box for hundreds of years, and we find them later on in time. So that's why I put that. These texts were unacceptable to the original guys in the monastery, and they just put them in a box. So again, we're getting. No wonder we have all these variants, and that's all we have today, or many texts that have variants, because they were already considered not the best to begin with. But that's what we have. That's what survived, and we'll take it. We can still study them and not have any problem with reconstructing the text. And so no one's making a claim that we just don't have the text anymore. Forget it. That's not the case at all. We are back to probably 95% of what the original New Testament said. There's no doubt it was written by who it was written, and when it was written in antiquity, way back in the 1st century. So the early manuscripts. These are, we're going to go over kind of some of the specific manuscripts. We've talked about kind of the transmission and how we ended up with what we ended up with. Now we're going to go over some of the specific ones. So there are these early. When we call them early, we mean ones that are no later than the 3rd, 4th centuries. Because in the 4th century, a new era of manuscript transmission began. So the early manuscripts, they are written on papyrus or parchment. They witness to a period when the text of the New Testament was developing freely. So there wasn't this diocese, that controlled the variant. We want this variant to survive, or that tried to clean it up or anything. These are very original. These early manuscripts really reflect an original tradition that's probably in most cases very close to the original writers, actual words that he wrote or dictated to a scribe, but the original writing. And we're getting close to them with these early manuscripts. So there's a total of 43 papyri and 5 uncials. An uncial is a script with rounded, unjoined letters from which modern capital letters are derived. So there's just a certain style of writing, and you have 5 of those and 43 papyri. So here's some famous ones. Papyri 46. That's Chester Beatty Papyri 2. And that comes from 200 AD. P46 contains all of Paul's letters except 2 Thessalonians, Philemon, and the pastoral epistles. It doesn't have those, but it has all the other Pauline letters. That's P46. And that's 200 AD. That's pretty close. He's getting pretty far back there. I mentioned the John Rylands manuscript, P52. That comes from 125 AD. It contains John 18, 31 through 33, 37 through 38. I believe it's written on front and back. So we have an early copy of John. That reflects that, of course, you had the rest of John. That's the small manuscript that survived. P77 has a few verses of Matthew 23, and that was from 150 AD, pretty far back. Then you have P45 from Chester Beatty Papyri 1, and that's portions of all 4 Gospels and Acts, all together, in 200 to 250 AD. Notice they are collated together like this, without any other weird lost Gospels. And this is before Romanized Christianity and the Council of Nicaea. So this reflects a time when people had already decided they belonged together. These 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts, who was also written by Luke. Of course you're going to include Acts. So you got all 5 of those books collated together from 200 AD. That tells you a lot. They must have been in circulation for a long time prior to 200 AD to end up all together by then. And they were obviously considered valid, legitimate, canonical by 200 AD. That tells you a whole lot. So remember that. P45. Very important one. There's other ones like P4, P64, Papyri 67. Contain portions of Matthew and Luke from 200 AD. P47, Revelation, somewhere in the 200s. It's part of Chester Beatty collection. P66, another collection called of Bodmer Papyri. That's most of John from circa 200 AD. P75, most of Luke and John 150 to 200 AD. So these and many, many others provide a broad sampling of many verses from the New Testament, from antiquity, from earlier than 300 AD. And they provide overlaps we can compare and contrast, and we can use early manuscripts to do it. So, key here is P45 and P46 contain a large portion of the New Testament. You've got most of the writings of Paul in P46 and all the Gospel and the Acts in P45 from, we'll call it 200 AD. And so they're already held in high esteem by that point. P72 also, that's a Bodmer Papyri, containing Jude and 1st and 2nd Peter from the 200s AD again. So in general, all of the Bodmer Papyri are well preserved with intact sewing. This is interesting. They're very well preserved. They don't have as many lacunae or little holes where you don't know what's supposed to be there because of damage to the text. There's less of those. Like for example in P66, and there's intact binding in some cases, and that's P75. And many undamaged pages entirely. So they're very well preserved. So Bodmer surpasses Chester Beatty in the quality of their preservation, length of their surviving texts, and textual significance. Interestingly, until Bodmer's discovery, many thought on the basis of P45 and P46 as Chester Beatty that the 2nd, 3rd century text was characterized by irregularity, but P75, a Bodmer text, proved all this wrong because its text was so closely similar to this later text called Codex Vaticanus in the 4th century that it almost looks like this old P75 was what Codex Vaticanus used as exemplar. I mean, it may have used a tradition from that, it may not have, but if it didn't, wow, I mean, you got a lot of preservation over time. If by the time the 4th century turns around, you still have a text, Codex Vaticanus, that looks just like an early manuscript from P75. That kind of blows any idea of irregularity out of the water. You have a very regular, a very well-preserved text over time. So these are very important early manuscripts. Of course, all the above that we just talked about were found in Egypt, and that's a consequence of the dry climate that preserves these papyrus so well. So you might ask, okay, if these are just Egyptian in origin, does that really reflect the rest of Christendom? We kind of have a biased source, maybe. So other, people, sometimes we'll use that as a way to fight Gnostic ideas. Well, you're only getting those out of Egypt, so you're not getting good Gnostic documents anywhere else. And sometimes we use that to say, well, Gnostic ideas were very isolated. But also, I'll give you, they could have been just, that's where they got preserved. But just keep in mind, you do have ancient manuscripts, old manuscripts that come from other areas than just Egypt. Though a lot of these early, that's just where they came from. Gnostics, you can't find them anywhere but Egypt, even later in time. Usually they're just in Egypt. They didn't really circulate. So I'd still make the argument that Gnostic writings, the lost Gospels, they're just Gnostic Gospels, they did not really gain a following like the early, the original 4 Gospels did in the writings of Paul in early Orthodox Christianity. And that just tells me who was obviously the truth and who was just outlier. So the Gnostics were kind of an outlier in Egypt. But the text of the New Testament wasn't. It spread much more than Gnosticism. So that slide kind of goes over that. And so also keep in mind that around 200 AD there was most people think there was a Christian scribal school based in Alexandria, which Alexandria had scribal schools there, professional scribes. And some of these people were Christians, and they also kind of went into preserving the New Testament professionally. So I would argue that these texts of the New Testament from Alexandria, Egypt, and Egyptian texts in general are reliable because they come from probably a school of professionals that probably had very good exemplars. They would have picked the very best exemplars to go from to use as what they were making copies of. So these early Egyptian manuscripts probably are the best ones to go to. They're the ones to go to. If you have a question about which variant's the best, you're going to weight the earlier ones from this school much more with heavy weight because they were practicing textual criticism in their own right, and they were closer to the original manuscripts, and they had more to go from that have been lost over time than we do, so we can trust them. They were just as professional as any of us are in our professions in our day and age. So, does early equal better? Yes. And I just went over all those reasons. And even if you just have fragments are not bad. They still represent a valid sampling of the book from which they came. And you can draw many legitimate conclusions from them about that book as a whole. You don't have to drink an entire bottle of wine to appreciate its quality. In the same, you don't need an entire Gospel of John from 125 AD to look at the fragment, the John Rylands manuscript, and say, that represents John. We know John existed as a whole in 125 AD. All we need is this fragment. So, real quick, after the early manuscripts, you have what's called the next stage, the Age of Constantine. Now we're dealing with Constantine and the Council of Nicaea, etc. So in the early period, before the 4th century, real quick, there was a paraphrasic text. I didn't really mention that before, but think of the Message Bible today, which is not really a translation. It's more of a paraphrase. I wouldn't use it at all to study the Bible. it's of no value to me. And some of these early texts that are paraphrased aren't as much value as these others have been talking about. But not until the 4th century did these text types begin. You may have heard of the Alexandrian text type, or the Byzantine or Lucian text type. Those are from 4th century onward. Prior to that, you didn't really have these formations of text types. So keep in mind, there was a persecution period, 250 to 260 AD, of the church. Then there was about 40 years of quiet, peace for Christianity. But then in AD 303, you had a terrible persecution called the Diocletian persecution, where this is where so many documents were lost. Who did the burning of the New Testament manuscripts? It wasn't Christians trying to hide Old Testament or old manuscripts, trying to burn up Gnostic Gospels and only preserve the ones that they like. Man, they're trying to survive. They're trying not to get killed. But think of what ISIS is doing right now over there in Iraq. People running for their lives. They're not concerned with agendas, large agendas of trying to hide texts from anybody in the future. That's ridiculous. They're trying to survive and not get killed. And that's what's going on in 303 AD. So we lost a lot of manuscripts, but it wasn't Christians burning their own. It was their persecutors, who were pagans trying to kill them, that burned their manuscripts. Unfortunately, we lost many of these older manuscripts then. During the 4 decades of peace I just talked about, between 260 and 303 AD, in Antioch, the early form of the text was polished stylistically and edited ecclesiastically, and expanded even devotionally. So that's called the Antiochian text. And it survived over time, and it later became the Byzantine imperial text after the time of Constantine, also called the Lucian text. And it is really from that text that we have the King James. It is not the best text, though, to use. Probably the better is the Alexandrian. I just mentioned Alexandria had a good scribal school, and then the texts that survived out of that scribal school were later continued on, and those texts became the Alexandrian text type in the age of Constantine and on, in the 3rd, 4th century onward. So that's the better. But from this period, the Antiochian text, you also had, there was another text called the D text. And really the precursor of the D text was Codex Bezae Cantabrigensis. But it didn't get as much support as the Byzantine imperial text, though the D text was probably also superior. But it lost out to the Lucian text. And after, once Constantine took over, you had the Byzantine Empire then. And so the Byzantine text type is what was picked. And it later became the received text that we get the King James Version translated from, per my understanding. So the major text types trace their origin to the Diocletian persecution and the age of Constantine that followed. So the Diocletian persecution, like I said, started in 303 AD, lasted for 10 years in the west and longer in the east. And it characterized by the systematic and systemic destruction of church buildings and the centers of public burning of manuscripts and those buildings themselves that housed the manuscripts. So, therefore, we have a widespread scarcity of early New Testament manuscripts. So, after Christianity got through all that persecution, the demand for New Testament manuscripts skyrocketed because so many were burned. So the number of available manuscripts was low following that persecution. So you have these undesirable variants left that were rubbed off palimpsests that I talked about, that they had to go hunting for what they could. And there's things that nobody thought to destroy. And that's the ones they had to go hunt down and use to build up this new supply of manuscripts for the demand, because Constantine, of course, made Christianity the official religion, right, of the Roman Empire, of the Holy Roman Empire, after the early 300s AD. So now you have all these burned manuscripts, and you got to make more. So, despite all of that, the New Testament survives, which I think is a miracle in its own right. But they make more, and again, it's the Byzantine imperial text that survives. It's what was stamp of approval by Constantine. So you have large copying houses employed. Bishops opened their own scriptura with whatever manuscripts they had on them that had survived. They didn't, they don't have time here to worry about it. They just made it through all this persecution and all this difficulty. They're just getting what they can get their hands on, and that's what they're going with. So the text that won out from this mass production is the Lucianic Byzantine text. And admittedly not the best one, maybe the worst of what was also put out by the Alexandrian school over here and the other school over there. But the Byzantine text won out in the Roman Empire that followed. The Holy Roman Empire that followed. You also had at that time, though, Athanasius, the powerful bishop of Alexandria, in 328 AD, and he didn't use a Lucian text type. So he appears to have used something more akin to the early manuscripts, like I was just talking about, as his model for New Testament production. Something close to what we find in P75, remember? That was probably something that the Codex Vaticanus was based upon, which we just talked about, actually. So that model was probably pre-Diocletian persecution, and that's why that Alexandrian model, that Alexandrian text type, is the better one. But that's way down in Egypt, and the Roman Empire, of course, grew, and that's what dominated Christianity. Hence the Holy Roman Catholic Church, etc., that came out of that empire. So that's why you have the Byzantine text type survive better than the Alexandrian, though it is also out there, and it's the best one to go with when you do dig it up, when you find it. As you can tell, this is from the Alexandrian tradition that was kind of started by Athanasius, who was using the early manuscripts. Go with that. And Codex Vaticanus, which is a entire New Testament. That's why it's so important. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's from the 3rd, 4th century, and it's a really good one to go with, and it's probably it's an Alexandrian text type, and it's based a lot on P75, Papyrus 75 that we talked about before, which was a Bodmer papyri. So these are the Christian areas. The Byzantine I just talked about, the Alexandrian, those are the main ones. Some people talk about a Western text, but I don't think many scholars really sign on to the Western text type anymore. It's mostly Alexandrian versus Byzantine. And the Byzantine won, like I just said, in the early age. Why no Jerusalem text type? There we have Caesarean down there. Why didn't it dominate? Well, just think about the history. That should tell you. Remember, the Romans attacked Jerusalem and really went hard against the Jews in the 60s AD. By 70 AD, they razed the temple to the ground. With that, many of Jerusalem's inhabitants, Christian and non-Christian alike, fled in the diaspora. And you also have the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 132 to 135 AD, and that drove more people away. So you don't have Christians around in Jerusalem to develop a text type. And you have these early manuscripts. The earliest copies were probably in the 50s into 60s AD. And so soon thereafter, people are, hightailing it out of there because of all this persecution. So you didn't really have a Christian area in Jerusalem. It spread. But I could see God behind that, trying to spread the gospel and force it to leave. People tend to want to stay where they are. And sometimes these bad things happen to get you to go out of your comfort zone. And that's what happened here in early Christianity, and why it even spread more than it would have otherwise. So, Codex Sinaiticus is the earliest extant copy of an entire New Testament. That's 375 AD. And then, I mentioned before, Codex Vaticanus back here. Codex Vaticanus I have here. That's 350 AD. It lacks the pastoral epistles. What are those? That's Titus, 1st and 2nd Timothy. Those are the 3 pastoral epistles. And it lacks revelation. But it's a little bit earlier than Codex Sinaiticus. And Codex Vaticanus is an Alexandrian text type. But guess what? Codex Sinaiticus also is an Alexandrian text type, and they're from the 300s AD. And so, even though Codex Sinaiticus is about 375 AD, it has the entire 27 books of the New Testament in it. Codex Vaticanus is missing 4. 3 of the pastorals and Revelation. But again, all Alexandrian text type, so a very good source. We want those. We like them. They weren't found until after the King James was written, though. So King James in the 1600s had to go by Byzantine. Later on, these Alexandrians get discovered. But that's later. Now we have them, so we should use them. So in summary, you got the early New Testament papyri from the 2nd, 3rd centuries Egypt, and they're probably the best source material. After the Diocletian persecution in the 4th century, we have 3. It's 303 AD, I said. That's the 4th century. We have 3 text types that emerged. Number 1, Lucianic. It won out by sheer volume and Byzantine influence on the church at that time. You have the Alexandrian text type that did survive in the Sinai Peninsula, etc., in these monasteries. Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus are prime examples of the Alexandrian text type. They're from 375, 375 and 350 AD, like we show there. And so those are what emerged after Diocletian persecution, Alexandrian text type, based upon the school of Athanasius. And then you got the D-text, which was more up there in the Byzantine area for this map, the D-text. Then we just have a very few copies of anything that represents the D-text. One is Codex Bezae Cantabrigensis. But it's also a very good text type. And if you find a D-text type, you may choose it over Lucianic Byzantine as well. So you're going to be looking for Alexandrian and D-text types to base your reconstruction of the early New Testament on. So kind of talked about, let's show some pictures and I'll end with this little section. There's a fragment of that's P52, John Ryland's manuscript. Remember, that's the copy of a little fragment of the book of John from 125 AD. There it is. This is from P45. That's what was the Chester Beatty Papyrus, and that's the 4 Gospels and Acts. Here's a portion from Luke. And here's P46. There's a portion of Galatians. Again, that's a Chester Beatty, I believe, and that contained a lot of the writings of Paul. P46. And here's just a fragment, a piece of it. Here's P90. It's an Oxyrhynchus Papyrus, and that was kind of a garbage dump, and they found this in it. It comes from John 18, and it's from 175 AD. It's amazing that stuff survived. And these are fragments of papyrus. They're rolled up like a scroll. Then you got Codex, which is a book. Codex is a book. There's Codex Sinaiticus from the British Museum, and it is a book. That's what Codex means. The first books like that, binding and everything, were made by Christians. Books come from early Christians trying to put the New Testament together in canonical form. There's a leaf from Codex Vaticanus. There's Codex Sinaiticus, like I said, a leaf from Codex Vaticanus. We'll talk about specifics of variants next time.